Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center for Humanities Director of Education. There's an old Yiddish proverb, man plans and God laughs. Uncertainty. It's a word we hear in every email, every newscast, every story, and in every conversation. Uncertainty. The world as we know it seems to be turning inside out. Uncertainty tests us, tests our creativity, our foundations, our nerves, our relationships, and ultimately our plans. Uncertainty will force us to make decisions we never thought we'd be forced to consider. Gisela and Friedrich, parents to a young daughter, Gerda, saw their world in Vienna upended in 1938. Nazi Germany took power of Austria, and the changes came fast and furious. Each day brought new headlines and new restrictions against Jews. It was exhausting to keep up, and no one was quite sure what the next day may bring. Gisela and Friedrich and 6-year-old Gerda were forced to navigate a world that was unimaginable to them only months earlier. And Gerda, while only a child at the time, was shaped by these experiences, a witness to how uncertain times can bring out the worst in humanity, but also the very best. Gerda's daughter, Betsy Touriel-Kapner, is with us today to share her family's story. At the Holocaust Center for Humanity, these stories are not history. They are living and breathing and shaping the way we understand and respond to the world around us. We are reminded each day that even in times of uncertainty, we have choices, and our choices have a ripple effect. I want to thank the teachers and students who are joining us today. A special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, for being the wizard behind the scenes on these programs, and to Lori Werschel-Cohen and her team for all their sleuthing and historical fact-checking, preparing descendants of survivors to be part of our Speakers Bureau. If programs like this one are meaningful to you, please consider making a small donation to the Holocaust Center so that we can continue to offer these programs. You can do so easily on our website. Just click the Donate Now button on the top right of the page. Thank you. After retiring from a career in the aerospace industry, Betsy felt a responsibility to share the unusual history of her mother Gerda and her grandparents Gisela and Friedrich. As a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanities Speakers Bureau, Betsy shares her family's story with schools and community groups throughout the region. Betsy will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. Thank you so much, Betsy, for sharing your family story with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, and Alana, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be here today to share with you my family story. I grew up in Tacoma with 2 brothers. It was a relatively normal childhood. I knew there was a connection between my parents, my mother, her parents, and the Holocaust, but no details were ever discussed. I learned about the Holocaust at summer camp, in Sunday school, and at public school, but it was never a subject that was broached in my home. If questions came up, they were changed, the subject was changed immediately. And I had so many questions. Sorry, we're working on some technical issues. One moment. Many questions I didn't know until much later in my life. One of them was why my mother had such a strong accent. My friends would always comment on that. Also, she spoke many languages. She spoke English, Spanish, German, and some Hebrew. I spoke English, that was all. So in junior high, I had the opportunity to learn German in school, and I thought that it would be a wonderful thing to do, to learn to speak with my grandmother who only spoke German. but also have a in-house resource of my mother who could help me with my homework. But what I found out when bringing home papers for help is that my mother only knew how to speak German. She could never read or write it, which was something that absolutely astounded me. Also, my grandparents lived in a very far away place. They lived in La Paz, Bolivia, in South America. No other friends of mine had grandparents that lived that far away. I saw my father's parents who lived in Seattle every week. I only got to see my mother's parents once a year when they would come to visit from that faraway place. And lastly, being Jewish as I was growing up was so important to my mother. She had us involved in Sunday school, Hebrew school. We were bar and bat mitzvahed. We went through confirmation, graduation, and were completely immersed in our Jewish youth group. It was a wonderful way to be raised, and I always enjoyed it, but I couldn't understand the importance to my mother. I took my mother to lunch as an older adult. My mother was in her 70s. I knew my time was waning. I had to get the story, and she was ready to tell me. And she told me an incredible story. She answered all my questions. I learned that my family was saved by a German Jewish miner. Unbelievable to me. So in 2019, after a 20-year career in aerospace, I retired. I realized that I wanted to make my retirement worthwhile to me and to make a difference. As I learned more about my mother's story after her passing, going through documents, I knew there was so much there. And I felt that it was my responsibility to tell this story and carry on my family's legacy. What you'll see here in the following presentation are family documents and photos that I found in my parents' belongings. A great deal of research has been done into my family's story by the Holocaust Center, and I can't thank them enough for all the work that they did and for the amazing details they uncovered. You'll see primary source documents, which are passports and visas, marriage certificates, and other wonderful things. I've also included contemporary historical photos so that I can show you the climate in Germany and Austria during the late 1930s and 1940s. The PowerPoint presentation you're about to see was painstakingly put together by the Holocaust Center. And again, I can't thank them enough for doing all of this work and allowing me to be here with you today. This is a photo of my family before 1914 in Austria. Austria was a very well-established Jewish community. The photo on the left is 3 generations before me. My grandmother, Gisela, is pictured on the far left next to her brother. My grandparents are also pictured with their 3 daughters. The photo on the right was taken in 1902. And if you follow the red arrow, you'll see the round, chubby face of my grandmother, who was 4 years old. She was born in 1898. My grandparents, Friedrich and Gisela Ashkenazi, were married in Vienna by a rabbi in 1924. My grandfather was a bank director at a bank in Vienna called Bank Berea and an accountant. My grandmother was a very successful seamstress. I was told that she made beautiful suits and gowns for wealthy wives of businessmen and politicians. In 1924, you couldn't just walk into a Nordstrom or a Macy's and buy something off the rack. Most everything people wore were handmade. The document on the right is my grandparents' marriage certificate. What I found in reviewing this document was so exciting to me. I didn't know before this project of mine the names of my great-grandparents. I discovered that my grandmother's parents were named Anna, and my grandfather's parents were named Emmanuel and Gisela. I learned that my grandfather married a woman with the same name as his mother, and I thought that was really wonderful. My mother was born in Vienna, Austria on November 12, 1932. The pictures you see here are of Vienna at that time. The photo on the bottom left is actually a newspaper clipping from 1925. This is a photo of the city of Vienna that my grandfather carried in his wallet for as long as I can remember. After my grandfather's passing, my mother took that clipping and kept it with her belongings. It's very special. The document that you see here is my mother's birth certificate. And what you can see is that she was born in Wien or Vienna, 1932. Now, it's important for me to go back, for me to go forward. I'd like to explain the climate of Germany after World War I. The German country was seen as the aggressor in World War I, causing great property damage and large loss of life during that war. The European allies signed the Treaty of Versailles with Germany. This treaty imposed crippling reparations upon the German government. It caused a global economic depression, money became worthless, and unemployment absolutely skyrocketed. People were very unhappy, life was difficult, and when that occurs, they blame. Those that were blamed were Social Democrats, Communists, and Jews. The photo you see on the bottom right was taken in 1932 in Hamburg. 1932 was the year that my mother was born. This picture shows thousands of people standing in an unemployment line. Elections were brewing in Germany at this time. And if you follow the red arrow on the large side of a warehouse in big letters, it says, "Vote Hitler." Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, winning the majority of the seats in the parliament or Reichstag. Hitler was appointed chancellor on July 30th of that year, and you can see him here addressing the Reichstag. Hitler was granted emergency power on March 24th, 1933, through the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act allowed Hitler to make any laws or any changes he saw fit without any oversight from the German parliament, and the Nazi regime took hold. My mother was just a baby when all of this occurred. She's pictured here as an infant in the arms of my grandmother and with her little friend. On March 15th, 1938, the Nazis marched into Vienna, into Austria. This is called the Anschluss. The photo on the left is of Hitler addressing the Viennese people, with hundreds of thousands of people showing up to hear his speech. The photo on the right was taken of the Nazi stormtroopers or brown shirts as they descended upon Vienna, showing all the Viennese people coming out to meet them. I read a book called Hotel Bolivia by a gentleman named Leo Spitzer. In that book, he writes of a New York Times correspondent who witnessed this scene. His name was G.E.R. Getty, and this is what he recalls. The brown flood was sweeping through the streets, stormtroopers, lots of them, barely out of the schoolroom, with cartridge belts and carbines. Austrian men and women were shrieking the name of their leader, Heil Hitler, down with the Jews, Heil Hitler, perish the Jews. I can't imagine my grandparents' fear living through this, trying to raise a young child, being persecuted simply because of their religion. Anti-Semitism in Europe was nothing new. It had existed for hundreds of years. But as Hitler took hold of these countries, his goal was to preserve racial purity. He felt that the Nazis, the German Aryans, were the master race, and Jews and any others were a threat to the purity of this master race. These benches you see pictured here with the dog on them sprung up all through Austria. This bench says nur für Arya, only for Aryans, showing the anti-Semitism all through the country. In 1938, laws swept through Austria as they had in Germany in 1935. These were called the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jews of their citizenship and their civil rights. Jewish doctors were no longer able to work in hospitals. Jewish attorneys could no longer practice law, and Jewish teachers were forbidden to teach in the schools where they had been. Jewish students, young and old, from university to elementary school, were also forbidden to attend school. My mother was 5 years old at the time in kindergarten, and she was forced to stop going to school. That is why she never learned to read or write German, but could only speak it. In the late spring of 1938, my grandfather went to work at the Bank Berea in Vienna, as he had for many years. He noticed that his good friend and his boss, the bank president, who was also a Jew, was not in. Shortly thereafter, he received a frantic call from the wife of his friend. She explained that the Nazis had come and arrested her husband and taken him to Nazi headquarters. This woman begged my grandfather to please go down to Nazi headquarters and work to gain her husband's release. My grandfather did just that, and in doing so, he too was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp. My grandmother and my mother learned of my grandfather's arrest, that he was sent to Dachau and then on to Buchenwald. In Buchenwald, because of my grandfather's great financial background, he was given the job of camp accountant. He did the books for the camp for the Gestapo during the day, and he was a janitor at night, swabbing floors and cleaning toilets. The letter that you see here was written by my grandfather from Dachau to my grandmother. All mail was severely censored by the Nazis. He wasn't able to write at all about what really was going on in his life at that time. All he could say was he was glad that my mother was growing and to send love to them. Liebe Geselle, liebste Gerda. In all of the research that was done, it was actually very exciting that we came across an article that was written specifically stating what had happened to my grandfather. In May and June of 1938, approximately 1,800 Jewish men were arrested. These men were prominent business and community members, arrested on trumped-up charges of being asocial and criminal. And like my grandfather, they were deported to the Dachau concentration camp. This was Hitler's attempt to remove Jewish influence from Austria. The article states what I said: 150 prominent Jewish men were arrested as dagger and truncheon armed Nazi brown shirts, acting as auxiliary police, began direct action to reduce Austria's 200,000 Jews. My grandfather's journey was from Vienna to Dachau to Buchenwald. My grandmother and my mother were alone. They lived in an apartment building in central Vienna, surrounded by non-Jewish neighbors, an artist, a dancer, and a dentist. The dancer had a son who was in the Austrian police. This family was very close to my grandparents. This son in the police department was informed every time that the Nazis were to come to raid his mother's apartment building looking for Jews. He called his mother and warned her to hide my grandmother and my mother from the Nazis. The dentist had his office in the same building as his apartment. He took my grandmother and my mother and hid them in a locked closet in his dental office as the Nazis came through their apartment building looking to take Jews away. These people that lived in my grandparents' apartment building saved my mother and my grandmother at their own peril. If they would have been caught, they too would have been arrested and taken away. But my grandmother and my mother were spared because of their goodness. Things progressed in Vienna, and in November 1938, Kristallnacht pogroms occurred. Kristallnacht means night of broken glass. The Nazis stormed through Vienna, breaking Jewish storefronts, Jewish synagogues, smashing everything they could see, Jewish homes even. My grandmother had enough. At this time, it was still possible to bribe Nazi officials to gain the release of loved ones from a concentration camp. My grandmother gathered her expensive jewelry and belongings and emptied their bank account, went to Nazi headquarters, and successfully gained the release of my grandfather from Buchenwald. One of the conditions of my grandfather's release was that he had to leave Austria immediately and go to a refugee camp in the United Kingdom. The document you see here is my grandfather's visa granted for travel from Austria to the United Kingdom. If you look closely, you can see it says good for single entry only. My grandfather went to Camp Kitchener as a refugee. This camp housed approximately 4,000 Jewish men released from concentration camps. My grandfather was there between March and July of 1939. His job in the camp was a ditch digger. He laid sewers. On July 27th, 1939, he was released. The letter that you see here is from one of the officers at the camp stating that this is to certify that Friedrich Ashkenazi has been at this camp until March 27th, 1939 until today, that he is a decent man, a good worker, and of companionable behavior. After my grandfather was sent off to the United Kingdom, she somehow was able to get a visa from the Bolivian consulate for transport for her family from Genoa, Italy to Bolivia. However, my grandmother did not know when my grandfather would be released. We've done a lot of research into this, but we don't know also how my grandmother learned about getting this visa. It could have been from those helping my grandfather in the refugee camp. She may have heard about that from them, or it could have been from one of her wealthy clients, but she went to the Bolivian consulate and received this visa. But again, I have to explain that my grandmother did not know when my grandfather would be released from the camps. And as things grew worse in Vienna, my grandmother worried so much about her only child, my mother. My grandmother signed my mother up for the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was set up by the United Kingdom to save the children in Europe. The Kindertransport saved approximately 10,000 of these children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. They were taken by trains to Hamburg, Germany, and put on ships to the United Kingdom. It was a wonderful attempt by the UK to try to save these children, but unfortunately, 99% of them never saw their families again. My grandmother took my mother to this train. And as a mother myself, I don't know how she possibly could have done this, but she left her there and went home. Upon arriving at home, my mother learned of my grandfather's release from Camp Kitchener. In great haste, she sent her nephew, my mother's cousin Heinz, who was 14, to get to that train as quickly as possible to get my mother off it so that she could come back home and be reunited with my grandmother. Luckily, it worked. My mother's cousin Heinz was able to get her off the train and bring her home. This is a copy of the visa that my grandmother got from the Bolivian consulate to travel out of Europe and be saved. This is a postcard that I found in my mother's belongings. It was very difficult for me to understand what it said. I didn't even know who it was from, but with the help of the Holocaust Center, it was translated. And I learned that it was a postcard written by my grandfather to my grandmother. He was in Camp Kitchener at the time, preparing for his travels to meet my grandmother and mother in Genoa. This postcard talks about my grandfather's concern of my grandmother and mother traveling alone from Austria to Genoa. It speaks about how he wishes he could help them and he hopes that they travel in good weather. He talks about making sure that my grandmother makes haste and that all of her papers are in order. He also talked about his understanding of my grandmother's great stress of packing up all of their belongings, leaving the home that they'd only known in Vienna. The last line of this postcard says, "Dearest Giza, don't lose your nerve now. This will and must work." My mother and grandmother's travels were from Vienna to Genoa, Italy. My grandfather's travels were from Buchenwald to the United Kingdom, through Calais and Mondaine, France. This is a copy of my grandfather's passport. And luckily, France at that time was not yet Nazi occupied. And on to Genoa, Italy, where he was reunited with my grandmother and my mother. From Genoa, they went across the North Atlantic, through the Panama Canal to Valparaiso, Chile. I mentioned to you a book called Hotel Bolivia earlier in this presentation. It was written by Leo Spitzer. And Leo's family story is similar to mine in that his parents and grandparents also escaped through Genoa on to Chile and eventually to Bolivia. Leo's grandmother is pictured here on the left, on the top row middle. And through passport information and documents, we've been able to discern that my grandmother, grandfather, and mother traveled on the same ship as Leo's family, the Virgilio, that's pictured here. I've had the great opportunity to speak with Professor Spitzer about my family, and I look forward to more conversations with him in the future. So my grandparents and my mother are now in Chile. Once they arrived in Chile, they were put on a train Per the Holocaust Encyclopedia, this train was referred to as El Express Judeo, or the Jewish Express. This train traveled up into the mountains of La Paz. And as it traveled, those on the train experienced illness. They became sick with altitude sickness because Bolivia is 14,500 feet above sea level. Not only that, as these refugees traveled in this train for 2 days, they saw scenery that was very unfamiliar to them. Rugged, snow-covered mountaintops, and the indigenous Indians of Bolivia, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, wearing multicolored woven garments. These people, these indigenous Indians, spoke a foreign language, ate different food, and had such a different culture. Truly, these refugees had to have felt like strangers in a strange land. Once my grandparents reached La Paz, they stayed in a one-room apartment with a bathroom down the hall, which served about 20 other people. My mother told me that during her first few weeks in Bolivia, that they were not able to leave their apartment because there was unrest and fighting in the streets of La Paz. A few weeks later, they were able to leave their apartment, and my grandparents went to collect the belongings that my grandmother had painstakingly packed up of what was left after bribing the Nazis. And they came to find out that everything that my grandmother had packed up had never made it on the ship in Genoa. It was confiscated by the Nazis. All my grandparents had were the clothes on their backs and the few belongings that they were able to bring with them on the ship. It's important for me now to speak to you about a gentleman who is very important to my family. His name is Moritz Hochschild, or known as Maurizio in South America. This gentleman was born a German Jew in 1881. He became a very powerful mining baron, and he also had great political influence. He was able to convince the Bolivian president to open its borders to Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. So many other countries had closed off their borders, but Bolivia, because of Moritz Hochschild's efforts, had opened them. We all know the name Oskar Schindler and the wonderful work that he did saving 1,000 Jews in Europe by putting them to work in his factory. Moritz Hochschild is known as the Bolivian Schindler, saving between 10 and 20,000 Jews fleeing Europe. 3 of the refugees he saved were my mother, my grandmother, and my grandfather. Things were difficult for my grandparents upon their arrival in La Paz. But my grandfather, he just picked himself up and he found a job. He went to work in the mines for Dr. Hochschild. My grandfather started out as an accountant for the company and worked his way up to become vice president. These are pictures that I found of him in the mines, and it was so exciting for me to see him here. He was a large man. He was always happy, always smiling, always a good word for everyone. My mother grew up in Bolivia. She went to elementary school in La Paz and then was sent to boarding school for middle school, high school, and college. She went to a town called Cochabamba, Bolivia. My mother's pictured here on the left, on the bottom step, at a formal dinner at her boarding school. My mother played college basketball, and she's pictured here number 4 in the center photo. And after graduating college, she traveled throughout the South America with my grandparents, and she's here with them at the La Paz airport. In 1954, my mom decided to travel to the United States. She was going to visit my grandmother's sister who had settled in Seattle. During my mother's visit, a double date was arranged between my mother and a gentleman named Buddy. Well, Buddy must have felt uncomfortable going on this date with a stranger from another country, so he asked my father, his good friend, to come along. My father, of course, brought along his longtime girlfriend, Clementine. We're not really sure what happened on this double date, but it appears that there was some date swapping that occurred because 3 weeks later, my mother and my father, Gabe, were married. They were married in a civil ceremony in June of 1954. Then my mother had to travel back to South America to get her permanent visa. And a few months later, in November of that year, they were married in a large, beautiful Jewish wedding at Ezra B'Sereth Synagogue in Seattle. My mother settled permanently in the United States in 1954, moving with my father to Tacoma. This is a copy of my mother's petition for naturalization. In 1955, my older brother Maury was born, and I came along in 1959. 8 years later, my younger brother David was born, and this is a picture of the three of us. My grandparents continued to live in La Paz, Bolivia. They visited every year and settled permanently in Seattle in 1974. These are a few family photos that I wanted you to see. This is me pictured at 2 years old. The middle photo is of my grandparents, my grandmother with a corsage. They were celebrating their wedding anniversary. They're pictured here with my Aunt Audie and my Uncle Fred, my grandmother's sister and her husband, who my mother came to visit when she met and married my father. The photo on the right is of my Uncle Fred, my mother, and my grandmother at my grandmother's 90th birthday. I grew up in Tacoma, went to University of Washington, where I graduated. The first photo that you see on the left is of my mother and I at my graduation from UW. The middle photo is 3 generations of women in my family, my mother, myself, and my baby daughter, Juliana, on the year she was born in 1999. And the photo on the right is my husband and I with my parents and children at my wedding in 2006. Today, I have 2 grown children. My son Joshua is 24. He too graduated from University of Washington and is living in Seattle. My daughter Juliana is 21, and she's attending Western Washington University as a junior. The middle photo is of my family, including my wonderful dog, Velcro. He is not with us anymore, but we have a new puppy named Gizmo that's going to grow up and look just like Velcro. And the photo on the right is of my husband, Charles, and I from earlier this year at my 60th birthday. My family escaped through bravery, perseverance, the goodness of others, and luck. Before World War II, there were 192,000 Jews that lived in Austria. 130,000 of those Jews were able to escape, but 65,000 were murdered by the Nazis. And after World War II, there were less than 10,000 Jews in Austria. 1 million Jews were killed at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, including my grandfather's sister, my great aunt Liesel, who I'm named after. And in total, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, as well as millions of other victims. Now I want to tell you about someone who shares a similar story as I. This gentleman, his name is Jorge Drexler, and he is an absolute rock star in South America. He, like myself, has a family story. Jorge's father, at 4 years old, escaped with Jorge's grandparents from Europe to Bolivia because Bolivia opened its borders to Jewish refugees when so few other countries would do so. In thanks to Bolivia, Jorge wrote a song on one of his Grammy-winning albums, and I'd like to share it with you. For those of you who speak Spanish, you can follow along with the lyrics. For those of you who don't, like myself, there are English subtitles. Today, our focus is truly on the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sorry about the video on the last song. Richard, would you like to start this again? My apologies. Again, today our focus is on the COVID-19 pandemic and the importance of our safety and the safety of our loved ones. But I must mention what you see here on your screen, which is a snapshot of today's refugee crisis. 70.8 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. 25.9 million of those people are refugees, and 37,000 people per day are forced to flee their home because of conflict and persecution. The scope of today's refugee crisis is greater in number than that of World War II, but similarities to the Holocaust do exist. People today are being persecuted because they are different. The atrocities of the Holocaust can happen again if we ignore the past. I'm here today to share my story, to talk about my past so that we can learn from these grave events. Learn to accept others that are different than us. Learn to respect these differences and to speak out against intolerance. I choose to use my voice against violence and hatred. I choose to use my voice for goodness and hope. What will you choose? Thank you so much for allowing me to tell you my family story.
Thank you so much, Betsy, for sharing your story. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to listen to the video. I'll try and post a link to it so you all might be able to listen to it on your own. Thank you for rolling with the punches as we navigate through this. Betsy, we have a few questions for you, and to those of you listening, please feel free to type in any additional questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Betsy, I'd like to start with this first one that comes from Robert Lowe. So I'll just read it out to you. It says, once you retired and decided to put your energies into this project, working with the Holocaust Center and learning to tell your story, how long did it take to get to this point where you can provide such a beautiful story and tribute with this PowerPoint?
Well, thank you. It took many months. I believe that we started this project probably close to 9 months ago, and it's been truly a labor of love.
Great. All right, here's another one. This one's from David Pierce. After World War II, Austria was considered a liberated country. What do you think about this situation, and what is your personal attitude towards Austria today?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak to the situation in Austria after World War II, but my feeling today about Austria, it's still a very special place. It was a very special place to my mother and to my grandparents, always. And they visited there after the war. And, you know, my husband and I went there as well. And I think that it's important to remember our roots. And that's, you know, where my mother and her parents came from.
And here's another question. This one is from, it says anonymous. Betsy, your presentation was so informative and interesting. Have you been able to do, or have you had any interest in researching the families of Moritz Hochschild and connecting with them? And what about the dentist who hid your mother?
Yes, I do have interest in reaching out to the Hochschild family, definitely. And I have done some research into that. There is certainly so much more to do. And as far as the family that hid my mother, I have not reached out to them. And unfortunately, a lot of that information was lost. But I do know that my mother and my father, when they traveled to Vienna years ago, they were able to go to the apartment building where my mother did live and where she was hidden. But I don't know that she was able to keep that information about the dentist. So unfortunately, I do not have that.
Thank you. And one last question for you here, which would be, if you think your parents had some advice for all of us today, what do you think it might be?
Well, in thinking of my grandfather, I believe that, you know, he would say, learn from your past, but don't let the difficulties define you. Persevere, because it can get so much better. And from my mother, what, you know, she taught me is to be kind and generous.
Wonderful. I think those are all words that we can live by. Thank you so much, Betsy, for being part of our Lunch and Learn program and sharing your family story with us today. Thank you to all of you who participated today and joined in and had been listening to our programs, whether it's this one or possibly you've been listening to multiple programs. I hope you will join us next week also at the same time for another speaker, Clarice Wilsey, who will be speaking about her father, who was a liberator of Dachau. And just on a last note, if you have found this program meaningful, I encourage you to help us to keep please offering these programs with a small donation to the Holocaust Center. Any amount is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you back here next week.